You're lying on your couch, the world feels different, and suddenly a thought surfaces that you've been avoiding for years. Perhaps it's something you've done that you're ashamed of. Maybe it's a pattern you keep repeating. Perhaps it's a part of yourself you pretend doesn't exist. Cannabis has a strange way of bringing these things to the surface. Carl Jung, the renowned psychologist, referred to this hidden aspect of ourselves as the shadow. He believed that confronting it was essential for psychological growth and spiritual transformation. But here's the question nobody's really asking. Can cannabis actually help us do shadow work? Or does it just make us think we're doing deep psychological work when we're really just getting high and having random thoughts? Today, we're going to explore the intersection of cannabis, Jungian psychology, and the journey toward integrating the parts of ourselves we'd rather ignore. Let's begin by understanding what Jung meant by the concept of the shadow. In Jungian psychology, the shadow represents all the parts of ourselves that we've repressed, denied, or rejected. It's everything we don't want to be or don't want others to see. The traits we consider negative, the impulses we suppress, the desires we're ashamed of, the anger we pretend we don't feel. All of this gets pushed into the unconscious, but it doesn't just disappear. It lives there in the shadow, influencing our behavior in ways we don't recognize. Jung believed that we can't become whole, can't achieve what he called individuation, without confronting and integrating the shadow. We must examine the aspects of ourselves we dislike and find a way to accept them as part of who we are. This is uncomfortable work. Most people spend their entire lives trying to avoid it. We build elaborate defenses to keep the shadow at bay. We project it onto others, seeing in them the traits we refuse to acknowledge in ourselves. We create personas, masks that we show the world, representing who we want to be rather than who we actually are. Now let's talk about cannabis and consciousness. Cannabis has been used for thousands of years in spiritual and religious practices. Ancient cultures understood that it could alter consciousness in ways that felt meaningful. In modern times, people report that cannabis helps them think differently, see patterns they normally miss, and access emotions they usually suppress. Some users say cannabis makes them more introspective, more willing to examine their own behavior and motivations. Others say it amplifies whatever's already present in their mind, making hidden thoughts and feelings impossible to ignore. From a neurological perspective, THC, the main psychoactive compound in cannabis, affects the endocannabinoid system, which plays a role in regulating mood, memory, and consciousness. It can reduce activity in the default mode network, the part of the brain associated with self-referential thinking and the ego. This is interesting because shadow work involves overcoming the ego's defenses. The ego is what maintains the separation between conscious identity and shadow. If cannabis temporarily weakens those defenses, it might create opportunities to see what's hidden. But here's where it gets complicated. Just because cannabis can surface uncomfortable thoughts doesn't mean it automatically leads to integration or growth. Jung emphasized that shadow work requires conscious effort. You can't just become aware of your shadow and call it done. You must actively work to understand, accept, and integrate it into your conscious personality. This requires reflection, honesty, sometimes therapy, or guided work. Cannabis might open a door, but you still have to walk through it and do the work on the other side. Many people get high, have profound realizations about themselves, and then forget about them the next day or dismiss them as just drug-induced thoughts. That's not integration. That's just having experiences without learning from them. There's also the risk of what Jung called inflation, where the ego identifies with unconscious material and becomes grandiose. Some cannabis users have mystical or spiritual experiences and then believe they've achieved enlightenment or special insight that makes them superior to others. That's not shadow integration. That's the ego co-opting spiritual experience for its own purposes. Real shadow work is humbling. It forces you to acknowledge your flaws, your darkness, your capacity for everything you judge in others. It doesn't make you feel superior. It makes you feel human. So we need to be careful about conflating cannabis-induced experiences with actual psychological transformation. The expertise might catalyze change, but the change itself requires sustained effort and integration. Let's explore what shadow work actually looks like. First, you have to recognize that you have a shadow. Many people genuinely believe they don't have hidden darkness. They think they know themselves completely. They don't. None of us does. The shadow, by definition, is what we can't see about ourselves. The first step is to accept that there are parts of you that you're unconscious of and that these parts influence your behavior. Second, you have to pay attention to projection. When you have strong emotional reactions to other people, especially disproportionate reactions, that's often your shadow being projected. The traits that trigger you most in others are usually traits you possess but don't acknowledge. If someone's arrogance drives you crazy, examine your own relationship with arrogance. If you're disgusted by someone's neediness, look at where you might be needy but hide it. This is painful work because it forces you to see things about yourself you don't want to see. Third, you have to examine your dreams. Jung believed dreams were messages from the unconscious, and shadow figures often appear in dreams as threatening or shameful characters. These aren't random. They're representations of repressed aspects of yourself trying to get your attention. Fourth, you have to practice what Jung called active imagination, engaging with unconscious material through creative or meditative practices. This might mean journaling, art, or imaginal dialogues with shadow figures. The goal is to give the shadow a voice rather than keep it locked away. Fifth, and this is crucial, you have to accept what you find without judgment. The shadow isn't evil, it's just unconscious. The traits you've repressed might be negative, or they might be positive qualities you were taught to suppress. Either way, acknowledging them and integrating them makes you more whole. Now here's where cannabis might potentially play a role. Some people report that cannabis helps them access the introspective state necessary for shadow work. It slows down their usual mental chatter enough to notice patterns. It reduces the anxiety that normally prevents them from looking at painful material. It creates psychological space for uncomfortable truths to surface. If you're someone who's normally very defended, very controlled, very unwilling to be vulnerable, cannabis might temporarily lower those defenses enough for shadow material to emerge. But, and this is important, the emergence of shadow material isn't the same as integration. Cannabis might help you see your shadow, but you still have to do the conscious work of understanding and integrating what you've seen. There's also the question of set and setting, which matters enormously with any consciousness-altering substance. Suppose you're using cannabis intentionally for introspection in a safe and supportive environment with the conscious intention of doing psychological work. In that case, that's very different from just getting high at a party. The context shapes the experience. Jung talked about the importance of ritual and sacred space in psychological transformation. Creating an intentional container for cannabis use, treating it as a tool for self-exploration rather than just recreation, might make it more likely to facilitate genuine insight. This doesn't mean recreational use is wrong, just that it serves a different purpose and probably won't lead to deep shadow work. Let's talk about the risks and limitations, because this is where a lot of people go wrong. First, cannabis can create a false sense of profundity. Things feel deep and meaningful in the moment, but turn out to be pretty banal when you examine them soberly. This is a real problem because it can make you think you're doing important work when you're really just having drug-induced experiences. Second, cannabis can become a crutch. If you need to be high to access introspection or vulnerability, that's a dependency that prevents genuine psychological development. The goal of shadow work is to integrate these capacities into your sober, everyday consciousness. Third, cannabis can amplify anxiety and paranoia in some people, which isn't conducive to shadow work at all. If cannabis makes you more defensive and fearful rather than more open and introspective, it's not going to help with psychological exploration. Fourth, there's the risk of bypassing. Spiritual bypassing is when you use spiritual concepts or experiences to avoid dealing with psychological issues. You might think you're doing deep shadow work with cannabis when you're actually just intellectualizing problems without making real changes in your behavior. Real integration shows up in your life. Your relationships improve. Your patterns change. You become more authentic and less reactive. If none of that's happening, the cannabis isn't facilitating growth. It's just creating interesting experiences. Fifth, cannabis affects everyone differently based on biology, psychology, and personal history. What facilitates insight for one person might just make another person foggy and unmotivated. There's no universal answer about whether cannabis helps with shadow work. It depends entirely on the individual and how they use it. So can cannabis be a legitimate tool for shadow work and spiritual transformation? Maybe, under certain conditions, for certain people, if used intentionally and integrated consciously. Jung himself was interested in consciousness-altering experiences and their relationship to the unconscious. He studied alchemy, mysticism, and non-ordinary states of consciousness. He probably would have been curious about cannabis and its effects. But he also emphasized that the work of individuation happens in ordinary consciousness, in daily life, in how you show up in relationships and challenges. Peak experiences or altered states might provide glimpses of the unconscious, but the real work is in the integration afterward. There's an interesting parallel between Jung's concept of the shadow and what some spiritual traditions call the night of the soul. This is the phase of spiritual development where you confront everything you've been avoiding. Your illusions break down. Your ego defenses crumble. You face the reality of who you are beneath all the stories you tell yourself. It's painful and disorienting, but necessary for genuine transformation. Cannabis might occasionally trigger something like this, bringing shadow material to the surface in ways that feel overwhelming. If this happens, it's crucial to have support, whether that's a therapist, a spiritual teacher, or a trusted friend who understands the process. Shadow work isn't meant to be done alone. We need mirrors, people who can reflect to us what we can't see in ourselves. Let's also consider the cultural context. In a society that's increasingly interested in psychedelics and plant medicines for healing and growth, cannabis often gets lumped into that category. But cannabis is different from classical psychedelics in important ways. It's less intense, more controllable, but also easier to use habitually without conscious intention. This makes it a bit of a double-edged sword for psychological work. The lower intensity means it's less likely to force confrontation with shadow material in the overwhelming way that high-dose psychedelics might. But it also means it's easier to use regularly, which could theoretically support an ongoing practice of self-examination. Or it could simply become a habit that you rationalize as spiritual, when in reality, it's just a way to zone out. Here's a practical approach if you're genuinely interested in exploring this intersection. First, be honest about your intentions. Are you actually interested in shadow work, or are you just looking for justification to get high? There's no judgment either way, but clarity matters. Second, if you do choose to use cannabis for introspection, do it intentionally. Set aside a specific time in a safe environment. Maybe journal beforehand about what you want to explore. Maybe set an intention. Treat it like a practice, not just consumption. Third, take notes during or immediately after the experience. The insights that feel profound in the moment often evaporate when you sober up. Writing them down lets you evaluate them later with a clear mind. Fourth, and this is crucial, do integration work afterward. Talk to a therapist journal about what came up. Look for patterns. Make behavioral changes based on what you learned. The experience means nothing without integration. Fifth, be willing to stop if it's not working. If cannabis makes you anxious, foggy, or dependent, it's not a useful tool for you, regardless of what it does for others. Sixth, remember that shadow work is possible and arguably more sustainable without substances. Therapy, meditation, journaling, and dream work can all facilitate shadow integration without the complications that cannabis introduces. Cannabis might be one tool among many, but it shouldn't be the only tool. Seventh, be skeptical of your own experiences. The ego is a tricky entity, and it can co-opt spiritual experiences. Just because something felt profound doesn't mean it was genuinely transformative. Look for evidence of actual change in your life, not just interesting experiences. Jung believed that the goal of psychological development was wholeness, not perfection. Integrating the shadow doesn't mean eliminating your darkness or becoming a saint. It means acknowledging and accepting all of who you are, light and dark, and learning to work with it consciously rather than being unconsciously controlled by it. This is radical self-acceptance combined with radical self-honesty. It's seeing yourself clearly, including the parts you don't like, and choosing to love and accept yourself anyway. That's individuation. That's wholeness. Cannabis might occasionally provide glimpses of that wholeness by temporarily dissolving the boundaries between conscious and unconscious. However, the real work of achieving it occurs in ordinary consciousness, through daily choices and an ongoing commitment to growth and self-awareness. So here's my question for you. Have you ever had an experience with cannabis where something uncomfortable about yourself came to the surface? And if so, what did you do with that realization? Did you integrate it into your life? Or did it just become an interesting experience you had that one time? I'm genuinely curious about your experiences and perspectives on this. Please drop a comment below, and let's have a real conversation about the relationship between substances, self-knowledge, and transformation. Here's what I believe after exploring this topic. Cannabis isn't a magic solution for shadow work or spiritual growth. It's not a shortcut to psychological integration. But for some people, used intentionally and integrated consciously, it might be a catalyst for insights that lead to real change. The key is understanding that the substance doesn't do the work. You do the work. The substance, at most, creates conditions that make certain insights more accessible. But accessing insights isn't the same as integrating them. That requires sustained effort, honesty, courage, and often support from others who understand the journey. Shadow work is some of the hardest psychological work you can do because it requires facing everything you've spent your life trying to avoid. But it's also some of the most liberating work because it frees you from being unconsciously controlled by the parts of yourself you refuse to acknowledge. Whether you use cannabis or not, whether you engage with Jungian psychology or some other framework, the core truth remains the same. You can't become whole without facing your shadow. You can't be truly free while parts of yourself remain hidden and rejected. The path to transformation requires looking at everything you are with clear eyes and choosing integration over denial. That's the real journey. That's what matters. Everything else is just tools and techniques in service of that fundamental commitment to seeing and accepting yourself fully. If this exploration resonated with you, if it made you think differently about consciousness, psychology, or your own shadow, hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. We're diving deep into the philosophical questions that matter, the intersections of ancient wisdom and modern understanding, the uncomfortable truths about what it means to be human. Thank you for being here and for thinking deeply. Remember, the shadow isn't your enemy. It's the part of you that's been waiting to come home.